He was already walking when he realized what he was doing. The water held him, cold, solid beneath his feet, in a way that made no physical sense, and for 1 second that stretched into something longer than time. Simon Peter stood on the surface of the Sea of Galilee, and the universe had no explanation for him. Then he looked down. The Sea of Galilee has a Hebrew name that tells you everything you need to know about it. Yam Kinneret, the Harp Sea, named for the shape of its shoreline, curved, graceful, deceptively gentle from above. From inside a boat in the middle of a storm, it looked nothing like a harp. The lake sits in a geographic depression nearly 200 meters below sea level, surrounded on 3 sides by plateaus and hills that funnel wind down into the basin without warning. Experienced fishermen, men who had worked these waters since childhood, knew to read the sky carefully. A clear evening could become a killing storm in 20 minutes. The water could go from glass to chaos between one breath and the next. This was not metaphor. This was geography. This was the physical reality of a body of water that had taken lives before and would take lives again. And every man in that boat understood this in the particular way that working people understand the dangers of their trade, not as abstract risk, but as weight in the chest when the sky changes color. Peter knew this lake the way he knew his own hands. He had grown up on its shore. He had pulled nets from its depths before dawn since he was a boy standing beside his father, watching the rope marks form on his palms and deciding this was a good life, an honest life, a life he understood. He understood the lake. He understood fish and tide and wind and the weight of a full net versus an empty one. He understood how to read the surface and what it meant and what to do about it. He knew the sound the water made in the hour before a serious storm, a low, sustained hiss underneath the wind, like something breathing wrong. He had heard that sound as a child and grabbed his father's sleeve without being told why. His father had nodded and turned the boat around. That was a lesson that went into the body before it went into the mind, and it never left. What he did not understand, what none of them understood, was what had happened that afternoon. They had watched Jesus feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Not a metaphor, not a theological interpretation, bread that multiplied in the hands of a man who had simply looked up at the sky, given thanks, and started passing baskets. The disciples had been the ones distributing the food. They had held the loaves in their own hands. They had felt the bread keep coming. Matthew records this in chapter 14. John confirms it in chapter 6. Both accounts agree on the 12 baskets of fragments collected afterward, more left over than what they had started with. The arithmetic of the miracle was written into the ground. They had not had time to process it before Jesus sent them away. That detail matters. He had dismissed the crowd and then dismissed the disciples, told them to get into the boat and cross to the other side while he went up the mountain alone to pray. The Greek word Matthew uses for constrain them to go, anagkason, carries the force of compulsion. He made them leave urgently. There is something worth pausing on in that urgency. The crowd had just been fed. The energy in that hillside was extraordinary. John's gospel tells us explicitly that the people were about to come and make Jesus king by force. The disciples were inside that energy. They had just watched something that felt, to first-century Jewish men steeped in the story of Moses and manna in the wilderness, like the beginning of something vast and political and world-changing. Jesus pushed them into a boat and sent them across the water before the sun finished setting. They were still holding the memory of 5,000 fed mouths when the storm found them. The boat was a working vessel, not a pleasure craft. Archaeological evidence from the first century, including the remarkable hull recovered from the mud of this same lake in 1986, dated to the era of Jesus and preserved almost intact, shows the standard Galilean fishing boat of the period measured approximately 8 meters in length, wide enough for perhaps 13 men, built of cedar and oak with a shallow draft that made it maneuverable but vulnerable in heavy weather. That boat, known today as the Jesus Boat, housed in a museum near Kibbutz Ginosar on the western shore of the lake, was found buried in mud when drought dropped the water level dramatically. It had been repaired multiple times over its working life. Timber from 11 different species of wood used in its construction. A boat that had been patched and fixed and kept working long past what a wealthier owner might have considered its useful life. It is not hard to imagine Peter on a boat exactly like it. 13 men, a shallow hull, and the wind was against them. They had been rowing for hours. Matthew says the boat was already many stadia from shore. A Roman stadion measured roughly 185 meters, and by some readings, they were 3 or 4 kilometers out. When the storm fully arrived, there were signs before everything broke open. The first was the quality of the silence before the wind shifted. Men who fish for a living notice when the water goes too quiet. It is not peace. It is pressure, building somewhere above the visible sky. Peter had noticed it and said nothing. That choice would cost him sleep in the years ahead. The second was the look that passed between 2 of the other disciples, a shared glance that carried the wordless calculation of men deciding whether the boat was enough. Neither of them spoke it aloud. They pulled harder on the oars instead. The third was the moment Peter realized he was the most experienced fisherman in the boat, and the wind was still winning. That was the sign no one named, when the best man for the situation feels the situation exceeding him. The 4th watch of the night. Roman military timekeeping divided the night into 4 watches of 3 hours each. The 4th watch ran from 3 in the morning until 6. They had been on the water for most of the night. They were exhausted in the way that comes from physical labor compounded by emotional saturation. The afternoon's miracle still unprocessed. The storm fighting them for hours. The darkness complete except for whatever the water reflected of a moonlit sky between waves. Then someone saw a shape moving on the surface toward them. To understand what Peter did next, you have to understand who Peter was. Not the Pope, not the symbol, the man. His name was Simon, son of Jonah. Shimon bar Yonah in Aramaic, the language Jesus most likely spoke to him directly. He was from Bethsaida, a fishing village on the northeastern shore of this same lake, and he had relocated to Capernaum, where he ran a business with his brother Andrew and their partners, James and John. Capernaum in the 1st century was a working town on the northern shore of the lake, a customs post on a trade route between the Mediterranean coast and Damascus, which meant it had a Roman tax presence, a modest synagogue, and the kind of rough commercial energy that comes from a place where different kinds of people are always passing through. It was not a theological center, it was a fishing and trade town, and Peter was the kind of man it produced. He was not an educated man by the standards of Jerusalem, The book of Acts, chapter 4, records that the religious authorities recognized Peter and John as agrammatos kai idiotai, unlettered and unskilled men, meaning they had not completed formal rabbinic training. They were working tradesmen, rough hands, practical minds. But Jesus had looked at this man and given him a new name, Petros, rock, the Greek transliteration of the Aramaic kepha, which carries the meaning of stone, of something solid enough to build on. It was a renaming, and renamings in Scripture always carry prophetic weight. Abraham, Israel, Paul. The new name is not a description of what you are. It is a declaration of what you are being made into. There is a particular grace in the fact that the man given the name Rock was also the man who sank. That the man Jesus said he would build his church upon was also the man who could not stay above water when the wind got loud enough. The name was not a description of Peter's achievement. It was a description of what Jesus intended to do with him, and that intention was not canceled by the sinking. Peter had already seen things that no one else had seen. He had been in the boat the first time, the earlier storm, the calmed sea. Jesus had been asleep on a cushion in the stern, the kind of specific detail that only an eyewitness would remember. The disciples had woken him in panic. He had stood up and spoken 2 words to the wind and the water, and there was a great calm. Mark records it in chapter 4. The disciples had looked at each other afterward and asked with genuine bewilderment, "Who is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?" Peter had been there. He had heard the question and felt it reverberate in his chest without an answer. He had been in the room when Jesus took the hand of Jairus' 12-year-old daughter, dead by every measure, and said, "Talitha cumi," little girl, get up. And she got up. Mark records this in chapter 5. Peter was one of only 3 disciples permitted inside that room. He stood 3 feet away when a dead child opened her eyes. He had heard the Sermon on the Mount. He had watched the leper fall at Jesus' feet and be made clean in a sentence. He had seen the paralyzed man lowered through a roof and walk home carrying his mat. He had heard Jesus teach in the synagogue at Capernaum with an authority the scribes did not have. Mark 1:22 records the crowd's reaction as astonishment, a word that carries physical force in Greek, a word for being struck. He had watched the people come out of that building changed in a way that formal religion had not managed to change them in years. He had been present at the multiplication that afternoon. He had held the bread in his hands. He had felt it come and come and come and not run out. Every one of these memories was layered inside him when the storm arrived, when the 4th watch came and the water was still fighting them, when the shape appeared on the surface moving toward the boat. The Greek word Matthew uses when the disciples see the figure is tarasso. They were troubled, agitated, a word that carries the sense of water being stirred up violently from within. They cried out in fear. The word for what they thought they saw, phantasma, means phantom, apparition, a figure with no physical reality. Their first instinct, after everything they had witnessed, was that what approached them was not real. That is not cowardice. That is honesty about the limits of the human nervous system. You can watch miracles and still, at 3 a.m, in the middle of a storm, see a shape walking toward you on the water, and reach for the most available explanation before you reach for the most extraordinary one. The brain is conservative by design. It protects you by defaulting to the familiar. It will choose ghost before it chooses God walking on water, because ghost is a category it already has. And then the figure spoke. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. The Greek phrase ego eimi, it is I, carries in the Gospel of John deliberate resonance with the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush. Matthew's Gospel does not underline this the way John does, but the phrase lands in the text with its full weight regardless. It is the same phrase, the same construction. In a Jewish context, for Jewish ears, it carried an echo that did not require explanation. And Peter, because he was Peter, because his whole soul was built on the impulse to test the gap between what he believed and what he was willing to stake his body on, Peter answered, not with a statement, with a condition. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. 3 theologians could argue for a lifetime about what that sentence reveals. It is not pure faith. It contains the word if. It is not pure doubt. It contains the willingness to step out on a word. It sits precisely on the threshold between the two, which is exactly where Peter spent most of his life. The if is important. Do not dismiss it as weakness. The if is the honest acknowledgement that Peter had just come off a night of seeing a ghost that wasn't a ghost, and he needed to know before he committed his body to the water. The if is not lack of faith. It is faith asking for confirmation before it bets everything. And Jesus gave him the confirmation, not a long answer, not a theological explanation. One word, come. Peter climbed over the side of the boat. Sit with that for a moment before continuing. 11 other men did not. They were fishermen. They had spent their working lives developing an instinctive and well-earned respect for what this water was capable of. They had just survived hours of storm conditions in a hull that was now soaking and straining. The wind was still blowing. The waves were still moving. Not one of them moved. We do not know what they were thinking in that moment. The text doesn't tell us, but we know what they saw. A man getting out of a boat in the middle of a storm at 3 a.m. to walk toward a figure on the water, and we know they stayed where they were, which is the decision most people make, which is not a judgment. It is simply what most people do when the cost of faith is that specific and that immediate. Peter put his foot over the edge. The Greek text of Matthew 14-29 is precise. Katabas apotou ploiou. He stepped down from the boat. Not a leap, not a dive. A step, the way you step down from a curb. The grammatical construction suggests deliberate movement, 1 foot at a time, weight shifting, and the water held him. What was happening in his body in that moment, the body of a man who understood exactly what water was and what it did to human weight, is something no ancient text attempts to describe, because no ancient text had the framework for it. But the body knows. The feet know when the ground beneath them is behaving impossibly. There is a cascade of physical sensation involved in experiencing a violation of physical law that no amount of faith entirely suppresses. He was walking on water. His feet knew they were walking on water. His feet had 35 years of empirical data telling them that walking on water is not something feet do. And he kept walking. For how many steps? Matthew does not say. The grammar suggests enough distance that he had genuinely moved. Not just 1 or 2 steps before the collapse, but a real crossing of space, a real arrival at something that could properly be called a moment of sustained miracle. There is something extraordinary in the silence of those steps. No shout of triumph, no announcement. A man from Bethsaida, who repaired nets for a living, walking on the surface of the lake he had worked for 3 decades, in the dark, in the wind, toward the figure ahead of him. The miracle was not loud. It was just true. Then the wind hit him, not a new gust. The same storm, the same wind that had been working against them all night. But something shifted in the angle of his attention. And suddenly he was not looking at the figure ahead of him. He was feeling the wind against his face. He was hearing it. He was calculating with the automatic intelligence of a man whose life had depended on reading weather exactly what this wind meant. The Greek word Matthew uses for saw, blepo, is specific. It means to observe, to direct the gaze toward something, to perceive with full attention. Peter looked at the wind. He turned his internal camera from the face of Jesus to the fact of the storm. That shift in attention from person to condition, from presence to circumstance, is the moment the text wants us to sit inside. Not because Peter was foolish, but because the shift was so completely understandable. The wind was real. The storm was real. His body had 35 years of survival instinct telling him exactly what to do when the wind got that loud on this lake. The miracle required him to override that instinct, not once, at the moment he stepped out. Continuously, step after step. The miracle was not a single act of faith. It was a sustained one. And sustaining it meant keeping his attention on the one thing that made it possible, and away from the 10,000 things that made it impossible. And then the Greek word for what happened, katapontino, to sink, but built from kata, meaning down, and pontos, meaning the deep sea. Not a stumble, a descent. He began going into the deep. The timing is everything. This is not a man who failed before he started. This is not a man who stepped out of the boat and immediately sank. This is a man who was already doing the impossible when the collapse began. He had proved it worked. His own feet had already written the data into his nervous system, and still the wind was louder than the miracle. He cried out, "Ekraxon," a sharp, urgent cry, and the words are exact. Lord, save me. 3 words in Greek, Kyrie, sosan me. In the entire Sermon on the Mount, across all of Jesus' teaching on prayer, no prayer is shorter than this one, and no prayer in the Gospels receives a faster response. There is a completeness in those 3 words that theology books struggle to match. No preamble, no explanation, no justification, just the name, the verb, the object. Lord, save me. It is the prayer of a man who has run out of everything except the recognition of where rescue comes from. Immediately, eutheos, the word Mark uses constantly in his gospel to describe the pace at which Jesus acts. Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him. The word for took hold, epelabeto, means to grasp firmly, to seize, to catch someone falling, not a gentle touch, a grip, the grip of someone who is already close enough to reach, which means Jesus had been walking toward Peter the whole time, which means the distance between them at the moment of the cry was not far. And as he was pulled upward, as the surface reasserted itself beneath his feet, Jesus spoke the question that has never stopped echoing. O you of little faith, why did you doubt? The Greek for little faith is oligopiste. One word, a vocative form, almost an address. Not you who have no faith, not apistos, not faithless, small faith. The prefix oligo means small in quantity, insufficient in measure, the same root used in oligarchy, rule by few. It is a precise diagnosis, not a condemnation. There was faith. It was simply not enough to complete the crossing, and the word for doubt, edistasis, comes from dis, meaning twice, distazo, to be in two places simultaneously, to stand with one foot in one reality and one foot in another. Peter was not a man who didn't believe. He was a man who believed in two things at once, Jesus and the wind. And the wind, for one terrible moment, was louder. The question Jesus asked is not rhetorical. It is not dismissive. It is the question of someone who genuinely wants to understand the architecture of the failure, because understanding it is the beginning of not repeating it. Why? What was the sequence? Where did the second belief get in? How did the wind become louder than the word? It is a question Peter carried for the rest of his life, not as a wound, as a compass. He was back in the boat, wet, breathing, the grip still real on his arm where Jesus had caught him. The wind stopped. Matthew records it as immediate. The moment both of them climbed into the boat, the storm ended. 11 men who had watched all of it fell on their faces in worship. Peter did not fall on his face. He sat with the water still running down his neck. He looked at his hands. He had done it. He had walked on water. He had also sunk. Both things were true at the same time, and he did not know what to do with the weight of that. Not the water, the weight of knowing that you touched the miracle and then lost it, that you were the only one who got out of the boat and also the only one who went under. The question was still in the air. Why did you doubt? Not an accusation, worse than an accusation, a genuine inquiry, as if Jesus actually wanted to know the mechanism, as if the answer mattered for what came next. Peter's hands were still shaking, not from cold. He looked at the surface of the water, now still, now glass, now carrying the first suggestion of the coming dawn at the horizon, and tried to locate the moment. The exact moment. The step where the miracle ended and the math began. He could not find it. That was the thing that would stay with him longest. He could not find the seam, could not point to the thought that had crossed the threshold first. The wind had hit him, and then he was sinking, and the two things had happened in a space too small to examine. Faith is not a switch. It is a surface, and surfaces can be lost in a second when you look away from the thing holding them. That was the moment something inside him that had always believed simply became smaller, not gone, smaller, oligopist. He felt the word before he had the Greek for it, a man standing in the exact place where the miracle had been and knowing that he had held it and then hadn't. The boat moved through the still water toward shore. Nobody spoke. The days after Galilee were not a collapse in the way people imagine collapses. There was no single breaking point, no dramatic moment where Peter sat down and stopped. It was quieter than that, and quieter things last longer. He was still with Jesus, still watching, still following, still in the inner circle of three, him and James and John, who were called forward when the others weren't. He was still the one who spoke first, the one who answered when Jesus asked the questions no one else wanted to answer. But something had shifted in the interior architecture of his certainty. He had stood on water and gone under. The two facts refused to resolve into something coherent. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being the most public example of a failure that happened in the middle of a miracle. 11 men had watched, not a private stumble in the dark, a witnessed descent. Every time he pulled the nets up in the morning, every time he looked at the lake, the sequence replayed in his body before his mind could intercept it. The step, the wind, the sinking, the grip. He could not sleep through the fourth watch any more. Something in him woke up at 3 in the morning and stayed awake until the sky changed. His wife noticed. He said nothing. What could he say? That he had walked on water and still managed to be afraid of it? The shame was not in having sunk. The shame was in the fact that he had gotten further than anyone else would have, further than anyone else had tried, and still it hadn't been enough. Enough. That word lodged somewhere in his ribs and stayed. He sat with Andrew one evening on the shore, and Andrew knew better than to ask. They ate in silence. There was fish and bread. There was always fish and bread now, ever since the afternoon with the 5,000. Even the simplest meal carried a kind of echo, and Peter ate without tasting it and stared at the water. Andrew was not a man who filled silence with words. Of the two brothers, Andrew had always been the quieter one, the one who worked steadily and spoke sparingly and noticed things without announcing that he had noticed them. He had been the one, John tells us, who first brought Peter to Jesus, who found his brother and said simply, "We have found the Messiah." No argument, no theology, just a fact and an invitation. Andrew had been watching Peter for weeks. He had seen the fourth watch waking. He had seen the way Peter avoided looking directly at the water when they pulled the nets. He had said nothing, because Peter did not want words yet, and Andrew knew the difference between a man who needed to talk and a man who needed to be sat beside in silence. That evening, he finally spoke. "You got out of the boat." Peter said nothing. No one else did. "I sank." "You also walked." Peter looked at his brother for a long moment. Andrew was not a man of many words, which was probably why the words he chose landed more accurately than most. But the comfort didn't hold all the way through the night. It never does. In the early stages of a wound like this, someone can say exactly the right true thing, and you can hear it and mean it and still wake up at 3 in the morning doing the calculation again. Why did you doubt? He had no answer. That was the bottom of it. Not the sinking, not the fear, not the failure. The inability to answer the question. If he could have pointed to the exact moment, the exact thought, he could have corrected it. He could have found the gap and sealed it. But the doubt had not announced itself. It had simply arrived like the wind, and by the time he noticed it, he was already going down. He tried once to reconstruct it, alone on the shore before the others woke, standing at the waterline with the water touching his feet, but not his full weight, letting the cold wake him the rest of the way up. He closed his eyes and tried to find the step where the believing stopped and the calculating started. He stood there for a long time. He could not find it. He walked back to camp and lit the fire and started the morning as if he hadn't been standing at the edge of the lake trying to diagram his own failure in the dark. There was a moment, one specific evening some weeks later, when one of the Pharisees, who had been watching Jesus from a distance, stopped Peter on the road to ask him a pointed question about the legitimacy of their movement. The man was educated. The man had arguments. He used the word of the law with the precision of someone who had spent years learning to use it as a blade. And for 30 seconds, Peter felt the familiar pull of the exit, the temptation to say something non-committal, to soften the edges of what he believed, to not be the man who walks toward the impossible and fails in front of everyone. He felt the pull and recognized it. He recognized it because he had felt it before. Not the theological debate. The other thing, the temptation to stay in the boat. He looked at the Pharisee and gave the answer he actually believed, complete and unqualified. The interaction was not triumphant. The Pharisee was not convinced. Peter walked away unsure if he had said anything useful and fairly certain he had made an enemy. But he had not hedged. He had not stayed in the boat. It was not heroic. It was exhausting. It was the difference between a man who has given up and a man who has not quite given up yet. And some days those two things look identical from the outside. The turning point was not a sermon. It was not a vision. It was not a moment of supernatural clarity that swept through him like the calm that had followed the storm. It was an ordinary morning on an ordinary shore, and Jesus was there. Not the dramatic presence, not the figure walking on water. Jesus, sitting by a charcoal fire with fish already cooking on it and bread laid out, waiting for the men coming in from their night of fishing. Ordinary. A meal prepared by hands that could stop storms, presented simply, without announcement, as though the most natural thing in the world was this, that he had come to feed them again. John records this scene in chapter 21. After the resurrection, after everything, the disciples had gone back to fishing, which is what you do when the story you thought you were living turns out to be more complicated than you understood. Peter had said, "I am going fishing," and the others had said, "We will go with you." They fished all night and caught nothing. That detail is important too. Not a symbolic nothing. An actual empty net at the end of a full night of labor. The men who had watched bread multiply and bodies rise from the dead were now sitting in a boat with a net that had produced nothing, watching the sky get lighter, doing the calculation of another failed night. Then from the shore, in the early morning, a figure called to them. Cast the net on the right side. They cast it. They could not draw it in for the quantity of fish. And that was when the disciple Jesus loved said quietly to Peter, "It is the Lord." Simon Peter, who was stripped for work, wrapped his outer garment around him. The ancient text preserves this specific, almost domestic detail, and jumped into the water, not to walk on it, to swim through it, toward him. No miracle this time, no surface to stand on, just a man in the water, closing the distance between himself and the person he loved in the most direct way available to him. That jump was the first step back, not the triumphant return, not the man who had mastered his fear and arrived gleaming on the other side of it. A wet, working fisherman swimming 100 yards because he couldn't wait for the boat. He was not walking on the water. He was moving through it the normal way, the human way, the way that requires effort and leaves you soaked. And in that moment, choosing presence over composure, choosing to close the distance even imperfectly, something in the arithmetic of the storm and the miracle and the question and the long fourth watch nights began to resolve. When they reached shore, Jesus said nothing about the water. He said, "Come and have breakfast." They ate together in the early morning, the fire crackling, the smell of fish and the lake and the smoke of the charcoal. The same kind of charcoal fire, John notes carefully, outside which Peter had stood 3 times and denied knowing him. John 18:18 uses the specific Greek anthrakia, a charcoal fire. John uses it again here in chapter 21. The repetition is not accidental. This meal was set in the same sensory register as the worst night of Peter's life. And Jesus fed him anyway. And then 3 times, once for each denial, asked him the question that was not an accusation. Do you love me? Not. Do you have enough faith? Not. Have you resolved your theological doubts? Do you love me? The restoration was not constructed from strength. It was constructed from affection, from the one thing Peter had never stopped having, even in the worst of it. Weeks later, the upper room, the sound of wind from heaven, something like fire, and a man who had once been unable to publicly identify himself with Jesus, standing up in front of a crowd of thousands in Jerusalem and speaking without hesitation. 2 months after that, the same man before the same kind of religious authorities who had intimidated him in the courtyard, and the text of Acts says they observed his boldness and recognized that he had been with Jesus. Not that his fear was gone, that his fear had become irrelevant. The day he realized he was going to be all right. A boat on the water, early morning, fish in the net, and not a single second spent calculating whether the surface would hold him. The question had changed. He was no longer asking whether he could walk on water. He was asking what Jesus needed him to do next. Years later, tradition places Peter in Rome, far from the Galilean lake where he had learned to read storms. An old man by then, measured in the work of his hands, and the distance he had carried the thing that had been given him on a shore he never quite stopped returning to in his memory. He had sunk. He had also walked. The question Jesus had asked on the surface of the water was not, in the end, a diagnosis of Peter's failure. It was the question that every person who has ever stepped toward the impossible and felt the wind, the question that every person who has chosen belief over calculation and then watched belief falter carries with them. Why did you doubt? Not, why did you fail? Not, why were you afraid? Why did you doubt? Which is to say, why did you let the second reality become louder than the first? Why, when you were already doing the thing you were told was impossible, did you stop trusting the word that was holding you up? It is, perhaps, the most human question in the New Testament. Because Peter's answer, the one he never gave aloud, the one he spent the rest of his life answering in practice rather than in speech, was not complicated. He doubted because he was standing on water in the middle of a storm, and the storm was real, not imaginary, not irrational, real. The wind was real. The waves were real. His body's instinct to calculate the probability of survival was not a defect. It was 35 years of hard-won wisdom about what this lake could do to a man. The miracle did not make the storm less real. It made the storm navigable anyway. That is the distinction that costs something to hold on to. Not faith, despite nothing being wrong. Faith, despite everything being wrong. Not the absence of the storm, the presence of something stronger than the storm. And maybe that is why the story is still being told. Not because Peter got it perfectly right, but because he got out of the boat at all. Because when a voice said, "Come," he went, even with the "if" still in his mouth. Because when he sank, the first word he reached for was not the name of the lake or the direction of the shore, but the name of the one standing on the water. Because the 3 words he prayed in the middle of a storm, "Lord, save me," turned out to be enough. And because the question waiting for him on the other side of the rescue was not a verdict. It was an invitation to understand what had happened, to carry it forward, to become, slowly, across years and failures and the long, ordinary work of loving what he loved, the man Jesus had named him to be. Rock, not because he never sank, because he always came back. Somewhere on the shore of a lake shaped like a harp, the water is still this morning. The surface holds the reflection of the sky perfectly, clear, unbroken, serene. And the question is still in the air, unanswered, open, handed to everyone who has ever looked at the impossible and taken one step toward it before the wind hit them. Why did you doubt? What would you have answered? If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments. I read every one.